You've heard before the term pecking order, right? It's the idea that if you're in a system or a place or a group, the pecking order is the understanding of who's in charge, who's second in command, who's third in command, on and on and on down. The higher you are up the pecking order, the more power, prestige, and respect you have. The further down the pecking order you are, the less you have and the more often you yearn to get to the top. Now, do you know where that term comes from? I was surprised to learn that the term pecking order comes literally from studying chickens, hens in particular, pecking each other. I had no idea. There's always someone to study everything. And so people were trying to figure out what the hierarchy of the hen pen was. They realized that generally the chickens were peaceful with one another. Every once in a while there'd be a little bit of aggression. They tried to figure out what that was. But why was it then a world where animals are often very aggressive with each other, chickens are not? And so over many years, chickens were observed over and over and over. And they almost always learned that there was a hen at the top of the social hierarchy. Then they realized that there was a clear number 2 and 3 and 4. And that it would generally stay that way until the hens became old and their strength diminished as they became older and older. They saw that younger ones would move up the pecking order. And they tried to reconcile, how did they know who was who in the pecking order? And they came to realize that there were occasional fights to display dominance. Number 1 would go around pecking and showing that they were dominant, flapping their wings, hitting the chickens with their beaks. But they also came to realize then that the hen, number 1, wasn't just beating up every hen in the pen. More likely, in fact, number 1 would go and find number 2 and would peck the snot out of number 2, and all of the rest of the hens would realize that if number 1 could beat number 2, I don't want to take her. So number 2 would turn around and find number 3 and peck them, 3, 4, and all the way down the chain. If you were 7 or 8 or 10 or 15, you would never challenge number 1 because you saw with your own eyes that they could defeat number 2. This is a fascinating social experiment, even to think about how other animals, including humans, behave. But I want to show you just for a moment a video of the queen hen establishing her pecking order. Check this out.
That big old bird in the middle is Mary, and what she's doing, have you heard that saying, establishing the pecking order? That's what she's doing. She's going around showing the other new chickens who's boss that were just introduced to the flock. She's going, I'm the big one. Do as I say. It looks a bit cruel, but that's just what they do. She's just giving a little notice that she's the queen. Oh, Mary. Right. We'll settle down in a day or 2.
New chickens show up, the pen gets moved, the queen always needs to flap her wings and peck a few little birds just to let them know what the order is around here. We can behave the same way. This is animal thinking through and through. And today I want to read a story to you about pecking order. In particular, concern about pecking order. And since we humans don't go around bashing our noses against each other to show our dominance, sometimes we need to act in a little more nefarious, underhanded, or quiet ways. Today's a story of someone trying to establish a pecking order in Jesus' disciples. In this particular story, it's the mother of the brothers who goes up to Jesus and tries to determine where her sons are in the pecking order. We're going to be reading from Matthew chapter 20. We're going to read verses 20 to 28. And if you would you join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord this morning? Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 to 28. When the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and, kneeling down, asked a favor of him, "What is it that you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at the left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup that I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared for by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Mom is taking after the hens, to say the least. She sees a group of 12 selected by the Messiah to be his disciples, his insiders, his followers, his learners. She looks the 12 of them up and down. She knows and understands Jesus. She can even confess that Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. She recognizes that his kingdom is not confined simply to this life. And what is it that she wants to do with this information? She wants to get her boys up the pecking order. She wants them to be seen as special. She wants to make sure that they have power in the kingdom that is to come. I tried to make sense of this in our world today. What are these moments where parents behave like this? Because clearly the other 10 boys are very upset. So I started thinking about my experiences in sports. If you've ever played on a team before, or if you've ever parented a kid on a team, you live in this tension of trying to stand up for your children and your children wanting you nowhere near their team. I was trying to think about back when I played football in high school, what it would have been like for a mother to go to my football coach and declare that her son deserved my starting position. Oh, that would have made me so mad. What a mama's boy. Who does she think she is? Who does he think he is? Now, imagine it wasn't just your starting position, but she actually thinks her frail little boy should be the starting quarterback, and shows up at practice and pulls the coach to the side and makes an argument that her son should be the starting quarterback on Friday night. This is an insane proposition. I used to be a varsity softball coach. I coached girls in high school, and I enjoyed it very, very much. But the thing, of course, I didn't enjoy was parents. The girls were great. It was the parents that were difficult. And I had all sorts of conversations with parents about playing time. It usually involved the girls who had a really good attitude, who made the team at the bottom of a roster because I wanted to be nice to them. But there was one time in particular that I had a really strange interaction with a parent. She had been a star athlete in the county not too long in the past. Multiple sports, she was very good. Her daughter had a lot of potential, but she was a freshman. And in the county that I was in, the way they had funded softball was that there was no junior varsity team. And so in order to prepare for varsity, you either had to play rec ball, travel ball, or sit the bench on the varsity team waiting for the upperclassmen to go away. Now, my starting third baseman, remember this is a girls softball team, my starting third baseman was about a half-inch shorter than me and weighed about 170 to 180 pounds. She looked like she was cut from rock. And she was the starting goalie and all-conference goalie on the girls' soccer team. She was an athlete, She was incredible. And she was a junior, and the mother of this girl that I was talking to was a freshman. No big deal. In my mind, this girl was going to be the starting third baseman of the varsity team her junior year. And she would play from time and again between here and there. Well, her mom stopped me one day and said, I want to know why my daughter isn't playing more. And I said, well, she's playing. I mean, there's definitely freshmen and others who play less than her. She is a freshman, you know. Yeah, I know, but I go and watch her play rec ball on the fields, and she tears it up there, and I just don't think you're giving her enough chance to show how good she is. And I thought to myself, rec ball? This is varsity softball. This is not the same thing as rec ball. We had a team down the street, a girl who was taller than me as a sophomore in high school, who could pitch underhand 70 miles an hour. This was not rec ball. And her mom was making an argument that because she could play rec ball, she deserved to start on the varsity team of her high school. And I tried to explain to her as calmly as possible. I mean, I loved this girl. I mean, she and I did not have a problem. She was probably 11th or 12th on my roster, which I think is incredible as a freshman. One day, we had an injury or two and a missed game or two, and so her daughter made it into the starting lineup as our right fielder, which is a great place to start as a freshman. And that day, we were playing kind of a middle-level team that we would play, a team that we should beat, but also not a walkover game. And that day, her mom was there to watch her start. And that day, we won, but her daughter went 0 for 3 with 3 strikeouts and 2 errors in right field. And her mother never talked to me about playing time again. When we are the parents, we defend our children. That's what we do. We want to see them succeed, and we want to see them get opportunities, of course. But sometimes the opportunities aren't there as we think they are. This is the case of James and John's mom. She comes to Jesus asking for something that's not available, trying to create a pecking order that isn't legitimate. This is not how Jesus thinks. In fact, he makes the point to the boys that this is how Gentile rulers, the Romans, the Greeks, the people that you don't like who are making your life difficult, that's how they think and act and live. In this community of Jesus, we don't live like the Romans do, trying to figure who's on top and who is the have and who is the have-nots. We think differently than that. And no matter how pompous James and John and their mother could be, they need some correcting here. Jesus asks, can you drink the cup that I drink? And they say, absolutely. Whatever it is you have, I'll be having the same. And they're thinking kingly language, right? You sit at a table and drink the cup of the king, and you're having the finest of wines. But the cup that Jesus is going to drink in very short order is his sacrificial death. And James and John will be nowhere to be found on that faithful evening. Their day is coming, though. Jesus tells them, you will drink this cup. And sure enough, we are given stories in Scripture and in history of them dying sacrificial deaths in the name of Jesus. They will get there. They will learn the lesson of humility and service and making themselves less. But today is not the day they're going to learn that. Today, they're listening to Jesus, but they're struggling to understand exactly what it is that he's talking about. In this story, we are invited to be a people who serve, who are willing to make less of ourselves in order to make more of Jesus, to live on a downward trajectory, understanding that the downward trajectory that Jesus lived in was precisely what God found faithful and raised up and glorified into heaven. Jesus is arguing for a different relationship, a different economy, a different use of our time, a different understanding of status than the one that the world is working itself through. Jesus wants his followers to not think about getting to the best seat at the table in heaven, but instead living this life as if they have been given the task of service. Jesus himself understands himself to be a servant. I was trying to look for a text to read about service this week, and it's just endless, the amount of texts that you could use, whether it's New Testament texts of latter writers talking about how important it is to serve, or just the sheer amount of times that Jesus talks about himself as called to serve or doing acts of service. Jesus is primarily a servant. He has come not to be served, but to serve. And he wants his followers to understand this. Now, I love the placement of this text in the gospel. I have not read on, but if you were to read on, we are just a few verses from Jesus entering into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, of him entering in as the colt, declaring he's come in peace, and people declaring that he is the king. But there is one short story between this kerfluffle that we've read today and Jesus' glorification on Palm Sunday and his coming glorification on Friday and Easter. A story of two men coming up to Jesus and asking for a request of him as well. They are blind, and through the crowd they're hollering out as loud as they can, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us." And the crowd keeps telling them to shut up. Be quiet. We're here for a reason. We want to see Jesus. And they cry all the louder, "Lord Jesus, have mercy on us." And Jesus hears them. Think about the difference of the requests in these two stories. A mom asking if her sons, who already have a place of honor, could get elevated even further. And now two men begging that Jesus would have mercy upon them. And Jesus goes over and says, what do you want us to do, or what do you want me to do for you? And they said, "We want our sight." And Jesus had compassion on them, touched their eyes, and they received their sight. This is a physical story. It's a physical healing. But in the text, I am convinced that it is placed after this story of people who can't see what Jesus is doing, who don't understand the sort of life that Jesus is calling them to. They don't get it. They're asking the wrong questions. And Jesus rebukes them and teaches them and shapes them to think new and different about the life that they've been given. And it's immediately followed by a miracle story of people who didn't see and now they see. It is both literal and metaphorical in the text. Can we see what Jesus is doing? We may have eyes to see what color shirts we're wearing, but do we have spiritual eyes to see and understand the task that Jesus is up to in this world and is calling us to participate in? This task is to learn to love him not for our own status, but to understand that's assured in our relationship to him. God will glorify us into a place of honor in heaven if we love Jesus. It's as simple as that. There's no bartering or pecking to get to a better place in the kingdom. But when we see the kingdom as shown to us in Jesus Christ, we begin to live like Jesus lived. The crowd is asking people who need mercy to sit down and shut up. And Jesus hears the particularity of their cry, and he goes and he serves them. He hears the yearning of his disciples to be elevated in status, and he invites them instead to become a servant, even if it means dropping all the way to the state of a slave in this life for the sake of another who needs to be served. He has come to serve, and he has come to teach us to be servants as well. I want to see Jesus. I don't want to spend my time yelling and hollering that Jesus would help me to see. I want to see him and to understand him and to know him. And we've been talking this last month leading into Easter about eating an elephant, about how one little practice at a time, giving ourselves, is the best way for us to get to the point that we take the elephant and eat it whole. We can't just stuff it in at one time, and if we want to be like Jesus, we have to practice one step at a time. And service is a beautiful way for us to not only match the heart of Jesus, but to actually put on his sandals and to try them on. Jesus, if we want to know his heart and his personhood, He understood himself to be a servant. And he invites us to serve as well. And so how is it that we serve? What does service look like? Well, we have to differentiate between legitimate service, the service of Jesus, and self-righteous service. Self-righteous service is what we so often see in our world today. One that Jesus condemned, saying you receive the reward in itself if you do it just to look like you are great and wonderful in the kingdom. Self-righteous service looks like being impressed by being the big deal, by doing something so that it's a resume builder, by making sure that you get an Instagram pic while you're doing it. Self-righteous service requires external rewards. It's transactional. Self-righteous service is affected by moods and whims. We only do it when we feel it. It's so often insensitive because it meets needs that serves me when I am ready, rather than serving the one who is in need. Self-righteous service so often fractures community because it glorifies the individual. This is not the way of Jesus. Jesus was one who, we're told in Philippians 2, emptied himself, set down the throne of glory to come and to serve as a servant for us. He descended all the way into our estate, lived like us, and offered every bit of himself to us in humility that God would use him. So my challenge to you today is to try out this external discipline. So many of the ones we've talked about is getting your heart right inside, but this is more of an external one. This is practicing that God is changing your heart, making yourself available to what it is that God is doing around you. I think practicing is important. I think it's deeply important. I probably say this because I grew up playing sports and I understand how important practice is. But I think you can translate it to the spiritual life as well, to following Jesus. We have to embody our beliefs and put them to practice that they would shape us. I heard a story this week that made me think about this just a little bit. Someone studied taxi drivers in London. Again, what a crazy thing to study. But they wanted to know about taxi drivers and how their brain functioned because, and this study was done before, first of all, before Uber, and second of all, before Google Maps, okay? So if you can think back all the way to the prehistoric age of like 2000 to 2005, right? You remember when you had to get somewhere and you didn't know how to get there? You remember how chaotic that could be? Do you remember the humiliation of walking into a gas station and asking for a street that you've never heard of before? I don't miss that at all. But this person was amazed when they were in London how you could just rattle off an address to a cab driver, and they had to know a network of 20,000 streets in London. And they were particularly interested in these 20,000 streets that were within 10 kilometers of King's Cross in London. And every taxi driver had to know all of them. It was so rigorous and difficult to become a taxi driver in this time that only 50% of people who began studying to become a taxi driver actually could pass the test and get their license to do it. So a researcher became fascinated with the kind of brain that could comprehend all of that in real time, take the most efficient route. If you take inefficient routes as a taxi driver, you lose money. You want more and more rides. So you got to get people there fast as possible. And so they knew this complicated interweb of streets, crisscrossing, under, over, next to, non-right angles, 20,000 streets and 10 kilometers. And they wanted to know what was going on with that. And so they started doing MRI studies of the brains of taxi drivers who were willing to submit to it. And they found that their hippocampus was more enlarged than almost every average person. Now, the hippocampus is basically like mission control of your brain. It's center, and that thing, like a muscle, was being used so much that it was growing. And so then they wondered, well, okay, that's interesting. What about bus drivers? That's a pretty similar job, right? A bus driver is public transportation, taking people across complicated cities from one place to another. But bus drivers do something a little different. Bus drivers follow a predetermined route given to them. People don't jump on the bus and give them an address. They just go to the next stop until people get off. So they started studying the brain center of bus drivers. And it was unbelievably smaller than the cab drivers. The cab drivers were constantly having to filter through new information inside of a predetermined area. Yes, now these cab drivers, just because they had a nice, large hippocampus, couldn't drive you around Athens, Greece. They had their particular area, and the constant work to understand that area was causing their brain to fire constantly. And like any muscle, it was beginning to grow and strengthen because of that. I think about the Christian life in response to something like this. Are we a cab driver or are we a bus driver? Are we just absolutely on autopilot, just driving from place to place, never aware of what's going on around us, never needing to understand how it all works together, never responding to the need of the person who walks right in front of us? Are we just living our life as if nothing is happening around us, going from place to place and finding that we're never really engaging at all? Or are we called to be more like a cab driver, recognizing that every single interaction offers to us something different within our web of understanding and knowledge in life? They come in, they ask for something, they share something, they tell something, and we begin to see, like a cab driver, the pieces come together and think, I can help you. I know something or someone or a way to help you get from point A to point B. Bus drivers aren't concerned with the destination. They're probably hardly even concerned with the particular of the person. A cab driver needs to understand where you are and where you're going, and their ability to see the particularity causes their brain to swell and to fire and to work at an incredible level. This is, I think, the call of the Christian life. To be aware of the people around us, to hear the particularities of people's stories, to recognize the struggles and the hurts in their lives, and to make them particular, even if just for a moment. Now, this is incredibly hard for me. This is not my favorite discipline. I love living like a bus driver, where I've got my plan and my schedule and where I'm going to be every minute. And interruptions can drive me crazy because they mess with the schedule. But Jesus here is inviting us to something radically different than worrying about our schedule. Jesus is saying to be challenged by those who need to be served, to recognize even that in Christ your point might not be your schedule, but the point might be to take opportunities to serve, to recognize the interruptions in life, the people who are needy as opportunities to be as Christ to them, that we have received the service and the blessing of our relationship to Jesus, and we can pass it on. This life of living in service, to recognize even potentially the smallest of interactions as an opportunity to serve, it can be a big ask. It can be frustrating. It can be time-consuming. It can end up being labor-intensive. It can become, sometimes it's just overly simplistic. You'd be surprised at what little you can do to make a huge day for other people. There's always a reason not to serve. There's always a reason, and usually that reason is the order of the life that I have created for myself. But this life is not about me. It's about Jesus. Jesus made himself less in order to lift us up. He invites us to do the same. Not every interaction may be an opportunity for evangelism. We may not always tell the story of Jesus, watch them saved. But maybe, just maybe, every interaction can be a moment for us to show the presence and love of Christ that could transform them. Every act of service could be so radically different than the way this world treats each other that they may begin to wonder what's different. This world loves to peck, and it loves its pecking order. Quit pecking. Quit playing the game of the world. Quit trying to gain status in this world in which pecking matters. Be like Jesus. Peck less. Serve more. I'm going to invite you, if you would, to join me in standing as we sing a final song today of worship.